WWE continues to soar in 2024. Business is still preposterously good at every financial level, ratings are steady, recently announced mega events such as WrestleMania 41 in Las Vegas and the first ever two-night SummerSlam in 2026 show that for now at least they have all the ambition to maintain or even increase their dominance. Which is a good thing too, because it could still be better. I'm Sai for What Culture Wrestling, and this is the lost magic of WWE's real golden era and how to bring it back. All tastes and takes are subjective, but it's fair to say that the traditional post-Mania lull that we as WWE fans collectively expect, due to years of it being the norm, hasn't come. Which is really saying something considering the size, scope, and definitive feeling coming out of WrestleMania 40. The Rock is no longer a TV regular, Cody has finished the story, and yet things, storyline and engagement-wise, are still turning over with gusto. Dare I say it, the market leader looks and feels like a market leader should. And more importantly, it's still largely proving to be an extremely enjoyable product to donate time and investment to. Over 2 decades after it last occurred, the company has experienced a third boom, much the same way that Vince McMahon himself suggested pay-per-view was a dying medium in the early 2010s, when appropriately was around the time he forgot how to book one well, let alone promote one well. Most fans and analysts had considered this larger wave of critical and commercial momentum a thing of the past. WWE was simply never going to be this big again, or even close. The ceiling had well and truly been put back on Titan Towers. Fractured hobbies and interests, the abject decline of quality during the years it kept a monopoly, and of course after that simply having viable North American competition for the first time in a long time, had made all of this an impossibility, and yet here we are. In short, fans are eating good, and we did have to endure gruel for a very long time, so let's just enjoy it. Amidst a raft of internal changes following McMahon resigning in disgrace twice, the creative shift can be put down to one man. Triple H desperately wanted to be credited for making the on-screen magic, if only because he missed what it had felt like when he'd done it once before. When Triple H took over the letters NXT and almost nothing else from the original version of the show, remember when it was a terrible game show concept? Yeah, let's forget that. He grabbed the company's developmental system by the scruff of the neck, and arguably he did so to make his next steps forward as a future company figurehead. And producing a good wrestling show was just a healthy byproduct for a self-confessed lifelong fan. The brand was given center stage on the brand new WWE Network as it launched ahead of WrestleMania 30. February 2014's arrival was one of the rare cases in wrestling history where the promotional bluster genuinely matched the vibe of the product. NXT was already being given the sort of gifts you only receive when operating under the auspices of the market leader, but that in itself aided its charm and insidious genius. I mean, the more you watched, the more you simply couldn't believe that this was a WWE product. Vince McMahon's pickled creative brain was beyond compare by the end of the 2010s, but it was still routinely shambolic in 2014. It didn't help Hunter's long-standing succession to be any more attached to it than he already was, and to this end, the game played another political masterstroke. On television, he was the authority figure trying to suppress Daniel Bryan's title aspirations, but over on NXT, he was crafting the Papa H persona behind and in front of the camera. It was surreal to see Shinsuke Nakamura go from the top of his game in New Japan to being in WWE, and the finger pointing to him as he posed with a WWE title, developmental or not, was the man that made it all happen. In real life, McMahon was telling Bryan before he'd even won the belt that Roman Reigns was always going to be the guy, while in NXT world, Hunter cultivated a community where anybody on the roster could dream of occupying such a spot. The former multi-time world heavyweight champion wanted to be the King of Kings once again, only this time in the roles that required him to wear a suit, hold a pencil, and yes, point his finger in pictures. Lots and lots of pictures. To do that, he'd have to curate a roster full of wrestlers desperate to grab the spotlight, then ensure that the audience he was engaging with considered these spotlights even brighter than the ones pointed towards the main roster's grandest stages. And to do that, he'd have to launch a takeover. Using Arrival as a template for a 2 to 3 hour special, Triple H set about nailing the TV to supercard formula right as some of the best talents in the Performance Center were experiencing new peaks as talents. The hourly television shows weren't always the most captivating, but the characters themselves certainly were. Ground-up investment will do that, and as buzz swelled in 2014, the likes of Sasha Banks, Sami Zayn, Bayley, Enzo and Cass and others were becoming genuinely beloved figures. To this point, WWE fans had been starved of projects that actually hit the heights that they promised promised to, or even continued long enough to gain momentum. But NXT was eclipsing all of that, despite the fact that this call was coming from inside the house that Vince McMahon was weeing up the side of. Editor, don't animate that, actually. Gimmicks sell t-shirts, but characters sell tickets, and the show had done a good job of presenting both. NXT shirts started cropping up in crowds at main roster events, and more importantly, NXT shows migrated to bigger buildings, starting with the epic takeover Brooklyn in the summer of 2015. The volume stayed up as matches attempted to top one another to historic effect. The only one that couldn't follow what had just electrified the audience was the main event. An amazing Finn Balor and Kevin Owens ladder match that couldn't beat a best of all time showing between Banks and Bayley. I mean, honestly, the impact of that on North American women's wrestling alone was seismic, but what it did for the brand was nearly just as big. It was almost always non-full sale from there. I mean, it had to be. There was too much money to be made, and as a developmental territory, NXT was still supposed to be prepping talent for eventual promotion. Like the product for a spell, the events were as close to perfection as mainstream wrestling had been in a long time. 5 or 6 matches over a tight time frame, all with reasons to be, with action that stood up for itself, and usually cards that peaked as they near their completion. The alchemy felt perfect until 2015 became 2016, and from this year onwards until 2020, talents routinely failed, usually through no fault of their own, the second that they left the protective bubble of NXT for the grim reality of the main roster. Takeovers were still peerless, but only as standalone events, and the hope of a brighter future had been stubbed out by too many failed pushes on Raw and SmackDown. The golden era was replaced by a silver one, and NXT's ebb and flow of third brand and developmental fell apart when there was a resounding feeling of please don't take this star up to Raw and SmackDown because they're doomed to be mishandled. And it happened again and again and again and again. How could they do this to my boy Keith Lee? But Triple H finally got the opportunity to reload his last save in Vince McMahon's old chair, and when he did, he set to work fixing what had been broken the first time around. It would be SummerSlam 2022 in the immediate aftermath of McMahon's departure before anything on the main roster felt quite as much like that anything is possible era. But it was what came next that really put things into high gear. Clash at the Castle 2022 was in the works before Vince resigned in disgrace, but the wheels that Nick Khan put into motion to make that happen have since been gelled expertly with Triple H's more focused and destination-centric booking. WWE had been paid by the Welsh government to put the event on. Khan had meetings with television executives as the very best version of the product he was selling came to town, and Triple H had a British babyface he could feed to Roman Reigns as a way to give the stadium crowd a match that earnestly felt like it belonged to them. It was the beginning of a series of similar scenarios. Sami Zayn main evented against Reigns in Montreal in a show that closed with hometown hero Kevin Owens saving his friend in an evocative post-match. Damian Priest, Zelina Vega and Bad Bunny had memorable nights on a Puerto Rican backlash show that generated near Steve Austin pops for Carlito, and somehow in WWE in 2023, Savio Vega. John Cena surprised London with his presence and the promise that he would at least try and fly a WrestleMania request up the corporate flagpole, and Rhea Ripley toasted a year as one of Raw's biggest stars by delighting an Australian stadium crowd like she was a decades-long pro. For those that have experienced both, it's almost like the takeover magic has been in the air. The reframing of the WWE B show into an event that attaches itself deep into the soul of those lucky enough to attend it has been a business masterstroke that goes beyond the strategy of simply, not being Vince McMahon. For too long, the events between the company's big four, or five if you want to count Money in the Bank, and you should, were mostly there to ensure that the raft of ambling, shambling TV characters had something to do. Superstars had never felt further away from the word, and the middling shows that they worked during downtimes for the business made the perception even worse. Take, un exemple, Becky Lynch following the run that made her a megastar. She became the man in the autumn of 2018 and made history in the main event of WrestleMania just a few months later, but the WWE machine and all of its faulty wiring ensured that she'd be colder as an act almost immediately afterwards. The show of shows always served as some kind of season finale, but good TV leaves audiences desperate for more when it does eventually return. Several years of risable post-WrestleMania pushes and weak backlash or payback adjacent events resulted in the opposite. As previously alluded to, generations of fans that could mentally or just literally switch off until SummerSlam or even next year's Royal Rumble because they knew how meaningless it would all become until then. Lynch was proof of this, going back to back to back in various matches against Lacey Evans at Money in the Bank, Stomping Grounds and Extreme Rules in a feud that marginalized both of them and alienated audiences. I mean, Stomping Grounds infamously took place in an arena that was mostly occupied by a giant curtain because attendance was so low. And it's not like the cards were concise to make up for the repetition either. The longer they went, the more the network exclusives were handed fat bonuses for the minutes watched stat going up, and nobody got to win other than the people behind the scenes, as the perfect opposite of fan service was finally achieved. Hooray! In a stark contrast, around that time, Triple H oversaw what many now consider the beginning of the end of the takeover era, with maybe the best ever edition of the show. April 2019's TakeOver New York was a special night that melded the real golden era of 2014 and 15 with the acclaim bait obsessed late 2010s. Johnny Gargano becoming NXT champion following an all-timer main event against Adam Cole was right out of the Bayley vs Sasha Banks playbook, while blinding undercard wins for the likes of the Viking Raiders and Gunther served as flashbacks to the days where a Sami Zayn, Kevin Owens or Shinsuke Nakamura could make it in a market leader that had felt closed off from their immense talents for so long. The game cracked the code once before and all he had to do was put his hands together. If required to flog advertising to the extent WWE now are, at least stack cards with all killer, no filler, ensuring that the on-screen experience is as good as the one in the building. That way, the people who spent big on attending events in Cardiff, Montreal, Puerto Rico, London, Perth, and so on are all likely to make the decision to do it again. Until everything within Black and Gold NXT outlived its usefulness with the launch of AEW and the onset of the pandemic, TakeOver remained a brand people held in the highest regard. If Triple H can do the same for the once maligned B-Show PLE tag, it'll be, and think of the ground that this covers, his biggest ever win.